Hi everybody, it's James here. How are you all doing? Welcome to another video. So today I'm going to do a bit of a themed video, something which has occurred to me to do. Sort of like a vinyl tag really, but with a specific theme. So I'm going to call it Show Me Your Firsts, okay? So a while ago there was a thread going around where you had to talk about the first album you ever bought, so I think it was extended to the first few albums. And that's what's given me this idea. So I'm going to run through 20 collection firsts for me, and then I'll invite you to do the same. Now, you don't have to do all the same ones that I have done. If you've got some other ones, you can do your own, or you could do a cross section of mine, or if it's only one or two of mine, and then add some of your own. It doesn't really matter, but if you want to do mine, that's absolutely fine as well. I'll put the questions down below so you can follow along. Okay. So just one last thing to mention: these albums are ones that I owned myself. Okay, that sounds a bit strange, but I grew up in a house where there were records. You know, my dad had records, and so these are not necessarily the first records that I heard, but they're the first ones I actually owned that were mine. Hope that makes sense. Okay, let's get into this. So, number one. The first album that you ever owned by your favourite band. Okay, and this is quite surprising for me, this one, because it's quite kind of late on. This is the White Album by the Beatles, which is the first Beatles album that I ever owned. I got this for Christmas in 1990, and yeah, kind of did sort of surprise me in a way, because by then I was 19 years old and I'd never owned a Beatles album. I knew the Beatles music, obviously, but that was the first one that I actually had in my collection. So, make of that what you will. Okay, number two, the first debut album that you ever had in your collection. So this one, I have to go back in time now to 1979. This is the Squeeze debut album, which had come out in 1978. I got their second album first. I got Cool for Cats in 1979 when it came out, and I love that. I just became a Squeeze fan overnight, but I didn't know that they'd had an album before that. It just never occurred to me. And a few months after getting Cool for Cats, I was out shopping in town with my parents, and we went to a record shop, and I think I just flipped through the S rack just to see Cool for Cats, and was rather astonished to find another album in there. At first I thought it was a new one, and then I looked at the date and discovered actually it was the debut album. So the Squeeze debut was the first debut album I ever owned. Okay, number three, your first ever live album. So for me, it was this one. It was Queen Live Killers, which was the second Queen album I ever owned. We'll be looking at the first one as we get to a later question. Don't know how I came to have Queen Live Killers next. I suspect it was just one of those things where I was in a record shop with my parents, saw it, just loved the look of it and asked for it, or they offered to buy it for me. I had extremely liberal and understanding parents, you know. I remember just absolutely thrilling to this record. We came home and Dad put it on his hi-fi for me, and I sat in the living room. It was the first live album I'd ever heard, you know. It was just so exciting hearing the roar of the crowd and just the music, and the absolutely fantastic gatefold in this just blew my tiny mind when I was a kid. It was my first real encounter with what you might describe, you know, rock dinosaur, rock god domain, complete Queen overload. It was truly eye-opening. So there we go, my first live album. Right, what are we on now? Not 1, 2, 3. So number 4, your first ever greatest hits LP. So I've worked it out that it would have been this one. This is Wings Greatest, which came out in, when did it come out? 1978, I think it would have been. So I was 7 years old, and yeah, I can't think of one that I would have had prior to this. So that's quite a nice one to have had. So when I got this record, it would have been the first time I ever heard songs such as Another Day, Live and Let Die, Silly Love Songs, Junior's Farm, Uncle Albert, Hi Hi Hi, Let 'Em In, My Love. I wouldn't have heard any of those songs before getting that record. Number 5, your first ever double album. Well, again, this one, I can strongly remember buying this, or having it bought for me by my dad. This is A Nice Pair by Pink Floyd. Collected together their first 2 studio albums. I got this probably in 1979, 1980. Brick in the Wall Part 2 had come out, was in the charts. I loved it. I bought the single. My dad had The Dark Side of the Moon already in his collection. I wanted The Wall, but I didn't get it until my birthday in the August of 1980. But before then, I got this. So that's my first double album. A Nice Pair by Pink Floyd. Right, now this next question. So the first album that you ever got, which turned out to be a legendary album. You know, because we all have albums in our collection when we're really young, the first few records we get, and there might be records that we really love, but they're not necessarily destined to be those great kind of epochal albums everybody says that you should have in your collection. So what was the first one that you ever had? Mine was this one, The Wall by Pink Floyd, which I would have got in the August of 1980 for my birthday. It was a gift from my grandparents, and yeah, Pink Floyd, The Wall, definitely the first proper slab of classic vinyl which I ever owned. Okay, the first record you ever received as a gift. Now when I say gift, it's got to be a gift that was gift wrapped. So it would have been Christmas, it would have been birthday, you had to open it up and it was a present. So mine was this. So we're going back a couple of years now to my birthday in 1978. This is my original copy of News of the World by Queen, which I got for my birthday, August 1978. It was a year after it had come out, I think. Queen, News of the World. Say no more. Okay, let me have a slurp of coffee. Okay, so number 7. The first album you ever got which disappointed you. Okay, so I kind of thought about this quite carefully, and I've come to the conclusion it was this one, McCartney 2. I'd been a huge fan of Wings, you know, I loved London Town, I was a big fan of Denny Lane, and I loved the group feel of the London Town album. You know, I liked the way that there were different voices, that Denny had a couple of songs, and I was just a Wings fan. So when McCartney 2 came out, I enjoyed it, but I think, you know, I was 9 years old, it was too experimental for me really, I didn't really understand it, I didn't warm to it. I wanted to like it, but apart from coming up in Temporary Secretary, and maybe Waterfalls, I wasn't all that keen on it. It's grown on me over the years, but it's quite funny how you never quite lose that sense of creeping disappointment. And I think perhaps for that reason, McCartney 2 is I've never particularly been all that fond of it. So even though it's a good album and it's an interesting record, you know, these things are really subjective. Okay, number 9. Okay, so this is the first album that you bought by an artist that you would later go on to collect all their discography, or at least most of their discography. So it's not the first band that you collected, you just choose a band or an artist from your collection, which you did end up buying all their records, and then you just try to identify what was the first one. So I'm going to go with Asia by Steely Dan, bought from Cobb Records in Wales on one of my many hunting trips there. Would have been probably in the 90s. I don't think I'd ever heard Steely Dan before. I bought it, it took about 2 or 3 years for me to click with it, and then after that I started buying all their records, and then after that I became an absolute Steely Dan nut for a couple of years and just absolutely became obsessed by them. So, but Asia was the first one. Right, number 10. Your first record that you ever owned in a specific genre of your choice. Okay, so it could be metal, it could be hip hop, it could be rock, whatever. So the first record that you bought in a particular genre, which later went on to interest you, or not, as the case may be. So for my one, I'm going to go with the blues, and this is B.B. King, There Is Always One More Time. And I'd never really heard the blues before. I heard a track from this record, I think it was the single, The Blues Come Over Me, which was played by Whispering Bob Harris on his radio show. It would have been in the summer or the autumn of 1992, after I graduated and moved to Leeds. I used to listen to Bob Harris's radio show at night, in bed, I think. You know, it was a great kind of cosy show, and he would play all this completely unexpected music. He played that song and I thought it was one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard, and I went down to Virgin Records the next day and I bought this record on cassette. Actually, I didn't buy it on vinyl, I bought it on cassette. The cassette is long gone, but last year I was lucky enough to find a nice vinyl copy of that. So B.B. King, There Is Always One More Time was my first ever blues record. Okay, so number 11, the first record that you ever remember recording onto a cassette. So this one I'm reasonably certain it would have been ELO, Out of the Blue. The reason I think that is because I've got a memory of going on holiday to Harlech in Wales, and I was probably only, I don't know, maybe 11 or 12 years old. and I know I'd been given a tape recorder for my birthday round about that time, and I remember having a tape of Out of the Blue and listening to it on that holiday. So that's kind of how I'm able to identify that. I'm 99% certain, you know. Okay, number 12. The first record that you ever remember buying because somebody else had raved about it. I find this quite an interesting one because when I was growing up, there was nobody, I knew nobody as into music as I was really, until I got to sixth form college when I was 16, 17, and I became friends with a guy who was really, really into hard rock and metal, and he was just a real enthusiast, and he had a big impact on me. There were a few things he recommended and raved about. I can't be certain this was the absolute first one, but it's certainly one of the 2 or 3 records that I bought because he absolutely used to wax lyrical about it. This is Now and Zen by Robert Plant. He was a big Zeppelin fan, a big fan of Robert Plant. I think he went to see him on this tour, and he just went on about it. And I bought the record from Cobb Records shortly afterwards, so yeah. The other 2, just for the record, there was David Lee Roth, Skyscraper, and there was Whitesnake 87. Those were the 2 other ones that he was very enthusiastic about, but I chose that one. Okay, so number 13. So this one might not apply to you, you know, I mean, these are all quite personal to me, but let's see. The first record that you got that your parents definitely disapproved of. So I've talked about this one before. This is AC/DC, High Voltage. My parents were always quite liberal. They didn't really mind the music I listened to. They used to raise their eyebrows occasionally. You know, there are certain songs on Squeeze records that reference venereal diseases and things like that. But AC/DC was something different. I've got a distinct memory of my dad really not really approving of the sound and the image. And there's a lyric on this album where Bon Scott sings about all the other shit that they're teaching the kids in school, you know, they were both teachers, and I can definitely remember them not being very appreciative of that. So, AC/DC, High Voltage, the first record your parents disapproved of. Right, now this next one hopefully is quite interesting. The first album you lost your mind to. So, I'll try and describe what happened. I got into Kiss at the age of about 12 or 13, and the track Cold Gin. There's a section in the middle, Kiss fans will know, where it breaks down into this very sort of almost choreographed, sequenced little guitar riff. It just goes da 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 da, and then it repeats. It's a really strange, kind of quirky thing, and I just lost my mind to it. I just remember being in my room and just grooving away to it, and I used to have a pair of drumsticks. I used to be banging them on the bed, and there was something about the groove in that section. And the closest thing I can reference is having some kind of whiteout, or just an experience of complete, everything just receded down the bottom end of a telescope, and the whole room vanished, and I was just in this pure space of just like, wow, this is fantastic. But not even thinking those words. It was just like, it was an absolute visceral, physical sensation. And it was probably the most dramatic instance of it I'd ever had, really. It was just, you know, to use a cliche, it was the power of rock and roll, really. That kind of transcendent moment of like, this is just so great. And I do think those things do stick with you, and that might explain why Kiss, even though, you know, to British music fans of a certain age, they tend to be a bit of a skeleton in the cupboard, really. But I think because I had that experience, that might help contextualise that a little bit. Okay, next one. We have another slurp of coffee. The first album you ever saw in someone else's record collection. Now with this one, I did make a slight guess. It could have been 1 or 2, but I'm fairly certain it was this one. Ummagumma by Pink Floyd. I know I saw this in the record collection of one of my dad's friends. It was my dad's boss. We went to have a meal in their house, in my dad's boss's house, him and his wife. This guy was a bit of a fan of music. He had a good record collection, and I remember going through them in the corner, you know, flicking through and pulling this one out and being quite excited. I'd never seen it before, never even heard of it. You know, I was quite into Pink Floyd already, but I didn't know anything about this record. My cousin had a good record collection, and round about a similar time I would have seen his collection as well, and there were certain records in his collection that I remember seeing for the first time. There was Heaven and Hell by Black Sabbath I saw in his collection, and a few other things, but we'll go with that one. Can't be certain, but let's go with it. Right, number 16. Okay, so the first truly elusive album. So an album that you searched for and couldn't find. So with this one, I'm fairly certain it's El Dorado, again by ELO. When I was in my teens, I got really into Jeff Lynne, ELO, The Move, Birmingham Rock, and I used to buy their records from Cobb Records every time we went there on holiday. And over perhaps, I don't know, maybe 6 months to a year, I picked up most of their records. Each time I went there was another one or two, and I grabbed them. But I couldn't find El Dorado, couldn't find it. We used to go there and I used to look for it. Eventually it did turn up on cassette, and I bought the cassette, but I don't know when I finally did get a copy of this record, but this kind of sticks in my mind really as the first time I ever became conscious that, okay, I'm looking for a particular record and I can't find it. So there we go. Right, number 17, the first album that you bought a second copy of. Now, I'm 99% certain again that this is correct. This is The Motors, my first favourite band, and famously this album did really badly because the cover was so dreadful, and the album was repackaged and came rehoused in a completely different cover, and at some point, it would have been probably in the 90s, I finally bit the bullet. I'd never bought this one because I always thought to myself, you don't really need to have 2 copies of a record. But I do have a memory of finally thinking, I'd really like to have that second version of Approved by the Motors. This was years before I joined the VC. So I'm 99% certain that Approved by the Motors would have been the first time I ever bought a record that I already had a copy of. It's not something that I do regularly. I've got a fair few copies of Band on the Run, I've got a few copies of Sgt. Pepper, but it's not something that I try to make a habit of. Right, we're close to the edge, close to the end now. Okay, so we're on number 18. Your first ever proper, true blind buy record. So for me, it was this one. It was Fleetwood Mac, Greatest Hits, which was bought from Our Price in Wrexham. I think I was probably about 17. It was before I went to university. It was in the sale, as you can see, $2.49. And I don't think at this stage I'd even heard the California version of Fleetwood Mac, you know, with Stevie Nicks. I just don't think I'd had any exposure to their music at all. I bought this because it was in the sale and I thought it looked interesting, and it was one of the first records, if not maybe even the first record that I bought with my own money. I can't be 100% sure of that, but I'm pretty sure that would have been the first blind buy. I took it home and listened to it, didn't know what to make of it at that point. I never heard the blues before, I didn't know anything about Peter Green or anything like that. I was a fan of Wings and Paul McCartney and the Beatles and all this stuff, and so it took years after buying that record. You know, I had to, perhaps like 5 years later, after I'd started to listen to Muddy Waters and some of those blues guys, I finally went back to this and was sort of like, right, okay, now I kind of understand that, so definitely a blind buy at the time. Okay, almost there. We're on number 19. So the first record you bought after discovering or joining the vinyl community. And surprisingly, I can actually remember. This is Paul Simon, Negotiations and Love Songs, 1971 to 1986. I'm not entirely sure how I remember. I just think that this was it. My record buying had slowed down a bit just before I joined the vinyl community. I was buying CDs. I never stopped buying records, but I think after I joined the vinyl community, I'd started to think more about picking things up on record rather than on CD. And I think when I saw this record, perhaps part of me might have thought, I'd have bought that on CD under normal circumstances, but because I've discovered this vinyl community thing now, and it's sort of reawakened my passion for buying records in significant numbers, so I think I'll get this on record rather than on CD. So that probably was the first record I ever showed in my first ever Vinyl Finds video. Couldn't swear to that, but it would certainly have been in that first edition. Okay, and finally, number 20, sort of a related question really. The first record you ever bought mail order. So again, this one is because of the vinyl community. I'd started watching VC videos. I was watching Ron Beaudry's channel, and he's really into reissues and showing really nice 180 gram reissues of his favourite records. And this was something that had never occurred to me. You know, I never thought that you could actually buy kind of new versions of records that you had in your collection anyway, but were perhaps a bit battered. I mean, my old copy of News of the World is shot to hell, you know, because I had it when I was, whatever it was, 8 years old. So I thought to myself, right, I'm going to buy a record, and I'm going to choose one which is significant to me, and this is the one I went for. I got the 180 gram reissue of Queen's News of the World. Sort of brought me full circle in a way, and yeah, I showed that on a very early video. I wasn't very impressed with the artwork, I seem to recall. If you compare it with the original version, it doesn't look as if they used the original painting. It looks like they've used a copy, but you can't have it all. So there we go. First record ever bought mail order, News of the World by Queen. Okay, so that's 20. 20 firsts. So there you go. Can you jump on this? Like I said, you might want to use your own questions, or you might want to use a cross section of mine, or you just might not want to do it at all. But if you do, I look forward to seeing your responses. Thanks for watching, and take care. See you soon. Bye bye.